Imagine you've just been chased out of one of the greatest cities on Earth. You've lost half your men. You've lost your gold. You've lost your cannons. Your surviving soldiers are limping through jungle darkness, bleeding and terrified, while the people you just tried to conquer celebrate behind you. Any rational commander would sail home, call it a catastrophic failure, and be grateful to have escaped with his life. Hernán Cortés was not a rational commander. What he did next, in the span of just over a year, resulted in one of the most improbable military reversals in recorded history. He didn't just return to Tenochtitlan. He returned with a navy, on a lake, hundreds of miles from the ocean, and he burned one of the most spectacular cities the Western Hemisphere had ever seen to the ground. This is the Siege of Tenochtitlan, the moment Spain didn't just win a battle, it won a continent. Before we get to the siege, you need to understand what Tenochtitlan actually was, because the Spanish who first saw it couldn't believe their eyes either. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco in the high valley of central Mexico, Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Aztec Triple Alliance, the dominant power of Mesoamerica. By 1519, it was home to somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it one of the 5 largest cities in the entire world. London at the same time held perhaps 50,000. Paris wasn't much bigger. The Aztec capital had clean running water delivered by massive aqueducts, a sophisticated market at Tlatelolco that astonished the Spanish with its order and variety, towering pyramids, botanical gardens, and a zoo. It was connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, broad enough for 10 men to ride abreast. It was also the seat of a military empire that had spent a century demanding tribute and human hearts from dozens of subjugated peoples across the region. That detail matters enormously. Those subjugated peoples would become Cortés's greatest weapon. Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico in 1519 with roughly 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a legal problem. He had launched his expedition against the direct orders of the governor of Cuba. He had no official authorization for conquest. What he did have was extraordinary nerve, a talent for political manipulation, and an almost supernatural ability to read a complicated situation. Through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and stunning luck, he marched inland and was actually welcomed into Tenochtitlan by the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II. The reasons for this are still debated: Aztec religious belief, political calculation, a desire to keep enemies close. But for several months, Cortés and his small force lived inside the most powerful city in the Americas, essentially holding Moctezuma under house arrest. Then everything collapsed. In the spring of 1520, a large Spanish force arrived from Cuba, sent by the governor specifically to arrest Cortés. He left a garrison in Tenochtitlan, raced to the coast, and, in a move of sheer audacity, defeated the force sent to capture him and absorbed its soldiers into his own army. While he was gone, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado massacred hundreds of Aztec nobles during a festival, igniting a full rebellion. Moctezuma died under murky circumstances. The city erupted. Cortés returned to a city that no longer wanted him in it. On the night of June 30th, 1520, a date the Spanish would call La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, they tried to sneak out of the city across the causeways under cover of darkness. The Aztecs caught them. What followed was a slaughter. Somewhere between 600 and 900 Spanish soldiers died, along with thousands of their indigenous allies. The gold they had spent months collecting sank to the bottom of the lake. Cortés, according to later accounts, sat beneath a tree on the other side and wept. Then he started planning his return. What Cortés did between July 1520 and May 1521 is the part of this story that military historians find genuinely remarkable. First, he needed to understand why he had failed. The answer was obvious: Tenochtitlan was an island. As long as the Aztecs controlled the lake, any force trying to take the city could be cut off, surrounded, and picked apart from canoes. The causeways were deadly choke points. The city's defenders could strike from the water on all sides and retreat whenever they chose. To take Tenochtitlan, you didn't just need an army, you needed a fleet, so Cortés built one, hundreds of miles from the ocean. He set his carpenter, Martin López, to work constructing 13 flat-bottom sailing vessels, brigantines, in the town of Tlaxcala, which sat on the far side of a mountain range from the lake. The Tlaxcalans, who despised the Aztec Empire that had oppressed them for generations, became his most vital allies. Tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors and laborers would ultimately fight alongside the Spanish. Without them, there is no reconquest. Full stop. The ships were built in sections, carried over the mountains in pieces. Some accounts say the convoy of parts stretched for miles and then reassembled on the lakeshore near Texcoco. While this was happening, Cortés was also recruiting. Reinforcements trickled in from the Caribbean. He now had around 900 Spanish soldiers, 86 horses, 18 cannons, and, crucially, an allied indigenous army that numbered somewhere between 70,000 and 200,000 warriors, depending on whose account we trust. The Spanish were never the majority in this force. They were the tip of a very large spear. He was also benefiting from something he hadn't planned and couldn't have anticipated: disease. Smallpox had reached Tenochtitlan during his absence, killing a devastating portion of the population and crucially killing the new Aztec ruler, Cuauhtémoc, who had organized the resistance after Moctezuma's death. The city that Cortés was preparing to attack was already weakened, grieving, and led by a new ruler, Cuauhtémoc, who was young, determined, and completely clear-eyed about what was coming. In late May 1521, Cortés launched his assault with a strategy of brutal simplicity, total encirclement, and strangulation. He divided his Spanish-led forces into 3 land columns, each commanded by a trusted captain, Padre de Alvarado to the west, Cristobal de Olid to the south, and Gonzalo de Sandoval to the north. Each column advanced along one of the great causeways, tasked with cutting off the city from the mainland and destroying the aqueducts that supplied its fresh water. Cortés himself commanded the fleet on the lake. The brigantines proved immediately decisive. Hundreds of Aztec war canoes came out to meet them on the first day of naval engagement, and while the individual Aztec paddlers were skilled and ferocious, they were no match for the Spanish ships, which carried cannons and could ram through formations of smaller vessels. The Aztecs lost control of the lake within days. Tenochtitlan was now an island in a much more dangerous sense. Surrounded, cut off from resupply, its water cut, its aqueducts destroyed. What followed was not a quick victory. It was nearly 3 months of grinding, brutal urban warfare that shocked even the Spanish, who considered themselves experienced soldiers. The Aztecs fought with extraordinary ferocity and tactical intelligence. They had studied the Spanish methods from the first encounter and adapted. They knew the horses were dangerous and dug pit traps in the roads. They knew the Spanish firearms needed to be countered with speed and surprise, so they developed nighttime raids and ambushes. Most devastatingly, they discovered that if they let the Spanish advance deep into the city and then cut off their retreat, the causeways became killing grounds running red with blood. This nearly worked. On June 30th, 1521, exactly 1 year after La Noche Triste, the Spanish suffered their worst single-day defeat of the entire reconquest. Advancing too aggressively without filling in a key gap in a causeway behind them, an entire column was ambushed. Dozens of Spanish soldiers were captured, and in Tenochtitlan, the captured Spanish were taken to the Great Temple and sacrificed in full view of their horrified comrades watching from the causeway. Cortés reportedly turned away and refused to watch. He almost gave up. Several of his captains counseled retreat, arguing the city was simply unconquerable. Cortés refused. He changed tactics. Rather than advancing and retreating, Cortés ordered his forces to tear down every building they captured before moving forward. House by house, block by block, one of the most beautiful cities in the world was reduced to rubble. The rubble was then pushed into the canals to create solid ground, eliminating the ambush points and water barriers that had been shredding his forces. The brigantines supported every advance, providing fire support from the flanks. It was a strategy of annihilation. Cuauhtémoc, watching his city literally disappear behind the advancing rubble line, appealed to neighboring cities for relief. None came. The Aztec alliance was fracturing under the pressure of the siege, the disease, and the starvation that was now gripping the surviving population. People in the city were drinking salt water from the lake. They were eating leather. They were eating the bark off trees. Still they fought. Contemporary accounts from both sides describe Aztec warriors continuing to resist even as their numbers dwindled catastrophically, driven by a combination of genuine courage, cultural duty, and the knowledge that surrender to the Spanish was unlikely to mean survival. By early August 1521, the Aztec defenders had been pushed back into a single neighborhood, Tlatelolco, in the northern part of the island. The population had collapsed from disease, starvation, and combat to a fraction of what it had been. Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape across the lake by canoe on August 13th. A Spanish brigantine spotted him, gave chase, and captured him. When he was brought before Cortés, Cuauhtémoc reportedly touched the dagger at Cortés's belt and said, in effect, "Kill me." He had done his duty. He had no more to give. Cortés did not kill him that day, though Cuauhtémoc's later fate was grim. He was tortured in an attempt to find out where Aztec gold had been hidden and eventually executed years later on a later expedition. But on that August afternoon, the siege was over. The city was unrecognizable. Where Tenochtitlan had stood, with its temples, its gardens, its market, its causeways, its zoo, there was now a field of rubble, ash, and bodies. Spanish accounts describe the smell as unbearable for miles around. Somewhere between 100,000 and 240,000 people had died in the siege and its immediate aftermath, a number that staggers comprehension. The greatest city in the Americas had been erased. On its ruins, the Spanish began building Mexico City, the same location, the same lakebed, drained over centuries, the same conquered heart of a continent. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not simply the end of the Aztec Empire. It was the moment the entire calculus of the Western Hemisphere changed. Spain now controlled the most populous and resource-rich region of the Americas. The silver that would soon pour out of Mexican and Peruvian mines would fund the Spanish Empire for a century, reshape global trade, and make Spain the dominant power in the world. Every other European nation, France, England, the Netherlands, would spend the next 100 years scrambling to catch up, probing coastlines for their own foothold, their own Caribbean island, their own slice of what Spain had proved was there for the taking, which is exactly the context you need to understand a place like Fort Caroline, on a river in Florida 4 decades later. The French weren't exploring out of idle curiosity. They were trying to break into a world that Hernán Cortés had locked shut on the morning of August 13, 1521, standing over the ruins of the most extraordinary city most of his soldiers had ever seen. The Siege of Tenochtitlan didn't just end an empire, it started one,